Welcome to Empower and Evolve, and I'm your host, Dunstan, and thanks for coming into today's episode. Now, this podcast is designed for those looking to break free from stagnation and enhance their well-being through actionable insights and inspiring stories. So you'd never miss an episode, hit that follow button and follow us through our social media accounts. Now, if you find value in our discussions, consider sharing this podcast with friends who you think might benefit listening today. Now let's get started on this journey of empowerment and transformation. Hi there, and thanks for coming back to Empower and Evolve. Now, I'd like to start off this episode with a lyrics rather from a song. From The Sound, the title of the song is Talk and Talk. My generation would know the song, and for the next generation or the younger ones, Gen Alpha, I don't know, the younger generations, just try to search for that song. But there's a line that I'd like to take out of that to start off today's episode, and it says, "I wanna know your mind, and you be into mine, so we can get ahead. Can we talk?" And it just kind of leans toward to today's topic, wherein how can I improve my communication skills to build better relationships, right? Now, communication in itself is an essential skill, right? It impacts pretty much every aspect of our lives, from our personal relationships to professional relationships in the workspace, or even our social environments, or neighbors, classmates, and everyone in between, right? Having effective communication can make the difference. So we'll discuss a little bit about a few key elements in being able to communicate clearly, and then we'll wrap it up with practical tips that could help you express yourself clearly and build deeper relationships with others. So without further ado, let's dive in. So when you talk about effective communication, we have to understand first, why is it important, right? Key points, right? If you have effective, or you can communicate effectively, you can express what you want to say. So it helps the other person or group of people or the other party understand you better. And by doing so, right, it reduces conflict. And it also strengthens and perhaps deepen the relationship. We are born to communicate, surprisingly. Because when you think about it, when you were born, or if you know a newborn baby, the first thing and the first form of communication is actually from the doctor, who taps the baby, and then the baby responds by crying, right? So there are two forms of communication already there: non-verbal, which is the tap of the doctor, and the verbal, which is the cry of the baby. And yet, even if they're in two different forms, the doctor is able to understand that response, right? So when you talk about effective communication, it's not just being able to say verbally what you want to say. You could be saying you're happy, or say, "I'm happy right now," but you have a sad face. It just confuses your audience. What do you really want to say? Are you really happy, or are you sincerely happy, or you're trying to say you're happy, but in reality, and the truth be told, you're not really happy at all because you have a sad face. And the same thing goes, right? If you're telling them you're happy and you're all smiles, your eyes are glistening, then you can communicate clearly because your facial expression is there, the tone of voice is there, the right words you want to say is there. Does it? It does make sense, right? So, the first thing you have to understand now is in asking yourself, is my facial expression the same as my tone of voice, the same as my body language, and is it aligned to the words that I wanted to say? Not a lot of people will have that capacity to be really fluent to express the right words. I mean, that's why there's a dictionary, there's a thesaurus online that you can use. But going to the simplest form and choice of words to express your thoughts, your feelings, as long as you try to put the right word in that right context, pair it up with the right nonverbal forms, that you can communicate clearly. Now, of course, we talk about communication in itself, right? There's always going to be barriers. And me being a comms major, there are a few things that will put a barrier in us being able to communicate effectively. The more obvious ones, I guess, would be technology. So right now we're using mobile phones, we're using pretty much the internet. So if one party has better internet and the other party pretty much is maybe less than 1 Mbps, I do not think that the person with the 1 Mbps can relay or even receive the right information. It could be already delayed information. The communication is already delayed. So technology is a factor. Another factor that I'd like to put out there as a barrier is coherence with the non-verbal form, which is your facial expression, your tone, your body language, right? With the words that you're using. Because if they don't sync, definitely there's going to be confusion, right? The third major barrier is prior experiences. So, you might be wondering, what's with prior experiences that hinders communication? Okay. When you talk about prior experiences, because it generates a certain bias, to make it more easier, I guess, for everyone watching or listening to today's episode. Let's say you've gone through a bad relationship. Right? Bad relationships, pretty much I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys can relate to this one. Right? A bad relationship, let's say your partner did something bad to you previously. Even if you are in a new relationship, you just saw the symptoms or you just saw a sign that's very similar to the prior experience, you already put a block in yourself. You try to be defensive, maybe try to be aggressive, to say no, without even trying to listen or experience what the other person's trying to relay. Maybe, for example, another example perhaps is if you've gone to a restaurant, a fast food chain restaurant, right? You tried one branch, they served horrible food. Or maybe it was unsanitary because there were roaches. And because of that one prior experience, even if the other person you're with tells you, hey, we should go to that franchise but on a different location, because of your personal bias already, you are not receiving the information. You're not allowing yourself that, okay, let's try it. Maybe it's a different experience. You already blocked it. Right? I'm not gonna listen even if you tell me it's a brand new branch, just opened yesterday and it's inside the mall. Because I had a bad experience with one branch somewhere. I'm pretty sure the standards are going to be the same with that new branch, right? I mean, that's bad bias, but it's it's something that we all have, right? Another barrier is having distractions and emotional triggers. So kind of goes hand in hand, but we can talk about them separately, right? So let's say you're on the phone with someone. I mean, to make the example more a little bit more obvious for here. You're on the phone with someone, and someone's trying to talk to you face to face while you're on the phone. Would you be able to understand the two people you're talking to, one over the phone and one face to face? At some point, you have to let the other person stop. First, I'm talking to someone, because if you try to do both, chances are you might miss both information altogether. You may be able to get one right and one incorrect. And if you're lucky, you can get both right. But I don't think everyone has. And I would be honest, I don't think I'd be 100% all the time can listen to two people at the same time and be able to capture everything clearly what they were trying to say. Right? I mean, you could try, but I'm telling you, it's gonna be something hard, right? And when you talk about emotional triggers, right? I was telling you guys this could be part of a distraction and could be discussed separately. When you talk about emotional triggers, imagine you have an issue with someone you didn't like, or something in your past that triggers your emotions negatively. So even if how hard the other person tries to explain things to you, because of that emotional trigger word or a phrase or an experience, you stop listening, right? And listening to someone without you really listening to the person because of your emotional trigger, pretty much you will have selective listening. You missed out the whole paragraph of what was being said, and you only stopped on the emotional trigger. Something that rang your ear, make you irked, make you upset, right? So you didn't listen to the whole 9 yards. You didn't listen to the whole story, so to speak. And these barriers, I mean, it happens every single time, right? Happens every single time. Sometimes we cannot control them. Sometimes we can. But through all of this, I think one of the really foundational skill when you talk about being able to communicate effectively is being able to actively listen. You might be asking me, it's communicating, so you're saying, you're expressing, you're talking, right? But how come you're telling me listening is a foundational skill? Here's just my take. Before you can even try to say the right things, communicate the exact words, the thoughts that you want to express, and marry it up with the right tone, the right emotion, you should be able to listen to understand clearly what the other person's trying to say. Right? And active listening is not just listening to the words. For example, I wanted to talk to someone, but this other person perhaps is watching TV, right? And they're very, very focused in watching a Netflix episode. Even if I try to speak slowly, speak clearly, catch the person's attention, because I didn't actively listen, and meaning to say observe the other person, that the other person was intently watching TV, whatever I would say would not go to the other person and be understood by the person 100% of the time, because, well, they're distracted, right? Their focus is not with you. So, I mean, that's just looking at the term active listening from another perspective. And when you talk about actively listening here, it's being able to be in the present, in the now. There's a term um, in HR, in the HR space. We call it presenteeism. You're just physically present but mentally absent, right? You're just there just to bond the clock, to time in for the day, but pretty much you're not productive at all because your mind is wandering elsewhere. And that alone is a good example of not being able to be actively listening to your surroundings. Yes, you're physically there and you're in the workspace or maybe in school or maybe at home with your loved ones. And yet, because you're not fully present at the moment, you are not putting yourself in a position to actively listen to others. And at the same time, be sensitive enough to communicate the right way. Right? So here are a few tips that can help improve your communication. Right? So to start off, I mean, springboarding from what I mentioned earlier, is to be able to practice active listening and not just the auditory side of active listening, but visually seeing that the other person is ready to listen to what you're saying, right? And one thing that I could give you a tip, especially when you're trying to talk already, because I think that's the more common approach that we do when you say active listening, is we tend to respond in the middle of what the other person's saying because we get triggered. Because we want to interject our thoughts around it without really fully understanding what they're saying. So maybe you could just bite your tongue, hold your horses, let the other person finish what they wanted to say. Right? Normally, and this is something I picked up in public speaking, if the person is ending their paragraph or their sentence, they would take about 2 seconds to 3 seconds of a pause. And maybe if you could use that, taking that approach in public speaking, if the person stops speaking for 3 seconds, you can go now talk by either confirming your understanding, or maybe if you really understood it clearly, say your response or give your response or communicate what your thoughts are, right? Another way of being able to position yourself, right? And just to tie it up there is, if I understood it correctly, or if you want to be able to go into that statement that you want to confirm that they're done, right? You could tell them, is there anything you want to add? Or is there anything else that I need to know for me to be able to understand you better? Right? It's a simple phrase. Just to make sure that you're able to hold what's in your mind and let the other person finish first. Second, when you want to be able to communicate clearly, be clear and concise. This goes, as children, and I'll take children as a very good example of being clear and concise when they try to communicate. If they're hungry, they will tell you, Mom, Dad, elder brother, sister, I'm hungry. If they're sleepy, they will tell you, I'm sleepy. Nowadays, as teens and adults, perhaps they would tell you, oh, I had such a long day, I want to go to sleep. A lot of people don't need to hear the explanation. Right? Yes, the explanation, the why is important, but for a lot of people, they don't need to know the why. They will ask you if they want to understand the why. But of course, you have to tailor fit that to your audience, right? I mean, if you're talking to someone like a kid and you want to correct their behavior, you explain the why, of course, definitely. But as adults, being direct to your thoughts, being clear with your message, and you avoid running around the mill or beating around the bush with what you want to say helps communicate better. You can also avoid, if you can, over complex language, right? You, like, the highfalutin words. I mean, there are a lot of highfalutin words out there. I mean, so, and for me, if you want to define a highfalutin word or a complex phrase, if the phrase is not something you use on your day-on-day conversations, that's complex already. If it's a technical term and you're talking to someone who is not in the same field as you are and using a technical term, that's complex language. Right? So, try to think about your audience, be sensitive enough, actively listen to your audience by observing them, trying to understand what's their language, what's their level of expertise in the conversation you want to start, right? And be able to use that as a guide for you to pick your words when you're trying to explain things. Third tip, and I know that we're going to be running a little bit longer for today's episode. Use I statements. And I think this is very important, especially if you're communicating in a relation with a partner or your relationship, right? The normal tendency when there's an argument, people tend to say you, and you start pointing fingers. I remember as a kid, there was an ad wherein if you point one finger, pretty much three fingers are pointing towards back to you. So when you start blaming others, you have to be able to, hey, stop, check. Is it really valid to blame the other person? Or is it better now to use an I? So maybe you could say, I feel, instead of saying, you made me feel. As a way to express your feelings, without placing blame. Another way, and I think I used this phrase on one of our first year episodes that I picked up from a public speaker named Vin Yang. He said, I'm coming from a place of love when you're having a difficult conversation. Because we connect ourselves with our emotions. Naturally, people are very emotional. And if you're having a difficult conversation and it's coming from the heart, it becomes sincere. Right? Very insightful idea when you think about it, because you can start drilling the facts of, let's say, things that you didn't like, things that was missed, let's say, that made you upset. But if you don't come from a sincere position that you're trying to explain to the person that this was missed, I didn't like what happened, right? It avoids it becoming a blame game, one. Two, it makes it sincere because you're saying this so the other person may know and be aware of the situation and how it made you feel, or how it made me feel, right? Next is understanding the non-verbal cues from the other person. So, when you try to talk to someone, have eye contact. Observe the other person if they feel bored already, if they're not in the right physical, mental, or emotional state to be communicating with you, then maybe think it should be put on a different time. Or you could approach the person, like in that example earlier, wherein, let's say, the other person's watching Netflix. You could ask them, hey, I need 5 minutes from you. Can you spare me 5 minutes now? I guess I need to tell you something really, really important. If they tell you, I'm sorry, I'm busy, you could now follow up the question when you could ask, could you give me a time? What time later in the day can we talk? Right? I mean, you don't have to push yourself, but learning how to communicate and compromise. Because if you ask that question, maybe what's the best time for us to talk? They tell you, okay, just let me finish this episode, give me 15 minutes perhaps. Go back to the person for 15 minutes after, or just before the 15 minutes is up, just to make sure that, hey, I'm here. I'm just waiting for you to finish your Netflix episode and we can talk because I really need to talk to you, right? And thank them, of course. Thank the other person's time. Because, of course, from their side of view, you're taking time from them. It's also putting their effort to listen to what you wanted to say. So, learn to be thankful for that. Last two on my list, right? Seek feedback. Growing up, and sorry for my voice kind of croaking already. I have a cough and flu, but when you seek feedback, as kids, and this is a personal story. Me and my brother, we have pretty much, we don't see things eye to eye, to the point that we shout and we argue a lot growing up, right? But then there was this instance. I mean, there was a common friend who was unintentionally there when the argument happened. I forgot which one was it, but it was like maybe eons ago. And then that person, being in the neutral space, talked to me and my brother separately. Asked me, pretty much told me the same information, used a different set of words, but the same message. And I gave a different set of response. Right? And that person told me, hey, it's the same thing that your brother told you. It's just because you had some bias, you blocked it already, you had a trigger phrase or a trigger word from him, you start arguing and not listening anymore. And then I was like, yeah, it does make sense. So, seeking that feedback, or maybe having another person give you feedback, especially when you're trying to communicate, or if you're honing your communication skills, like if you're presenting reports for those in the workspace, right? Or you're presenting a class report as students, or even talking publicly, or like in my case, when I do my podcast, I always ask feedback from my editor, from my listeners, how they liked and didn't like in the episodes, right? Because it helps me be better, tune myself on how I can communicate. If my messaging is still clear, or I lost the listener somewhere along the example, or maybe in a anecdotal story, and that's very important for me because I'm also honing my craft, right? I want to be an effective communicator. And last is, sometimes you need to practice, right? This is a tip I got when I was starting off my career in the BPO, in the contact center space. My supervisor before would always place a mirror in front of me because I was a newbie, right? Pretty much as a newbie, you have scripts to read. Although you can be free form, but there are scripts that you have to read and verbatim, like word for word. My supervisor placed that mirror in front of me and told me that whenever I'm trying to read a verbatim, whenever I'm trying to communicate to the customer, try to look at the mirror. And I was like, why? And then I realized that because I was looking at myself in the mirror, I became more conscious with my facial expression, with the choice of words, with my tone. And that's very important because my facial expression correlates to the tone that I was using when I'm communicating. And when we try to communicate now, because you're conscious, right? You see yourself and you try to match your tone of voice with how your facial expressions are, right? And my goal there is to sound more pleasant. I've learned to smile a little bit more when I'm talking in front of, when I was taking calls. And it did really have an impact with how the customers felt that sincerity, that lightness, that positive energy I bring in on a conversation with the customer. So, maybe practice with the peer. Like in my example, we had a common friend, maybe one of your close friends, perhaps. Especially if you're trying to deliver a difficult message, or you're trying to explain a report, right? Practice it with another person. Make the other person be your audience. Ask them first, did you clearly understood what I said? Second, did I have the right tone? Did I use the right facial expression, the body language? 3, did my statement or my sentence or the conversation piece I started made you feel indifferent? Made you feel that I wasn't sincere? Or made you feel that it's not what I really wanted to tell you? Because the body language and the facial expression and everything else didn't really match up and line up like dominoes, right? So those are just a few examples that you can do to improve your effective communication. And I hope that you can start practicing that because, we start communicating as early as kids, and even in our dying years, we will never stop communicating. And if we are able to communicate better, then we can have better relationships, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether it's a business relationship, whether it's in the professional space or whether it's in the social space. You'll be able to have more genuine, sincere, honest, and effective communication and relationships. So with that, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Again, remember, here at Empower and Evolve, our goal is to help you become a better version of you. Stay safe. Take care. Catch you next week. Bye for now. Hey buddy, thank you for joining us on this transformative journey of empowerment and growth. Now remember, it's not just about evolving. It's about embracing that incredible power within you to become the best version of yourself. Keep striving for greatness, because together, we can create a world where empowerment knows no bounds. And if you find value in today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and share this podcast with someone who could use that little inspiration. Until next time, stay empowered, stay inspired, and keep shining brightly on your path to evolution. With Empower and Evolve, you have the tools to unleash your potential and rewrite your story. Let's continue to evolve together.